how this goes, I don't think will reflect on you guys as much as it will reflect on me. We haven't really talked about this since the first few class periods, but early on, we tried to wrap our heads around and emphasize to some degree that Revelation has a certain genre, and the genre, the type of writing that it is important because it influences the way that we read the book. And we said that Revelation was in this genre called apocalyptic literature. What do you remember that means? Do you remember anything about apocalyptic literature, what that means? Even just tidbits. We'll just throw them out. It's a revelation. That's actually, apocalypse means revelation, so that's the title of the book, because the first word is the apocalypse, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Thank you, Brian. What else you remember about apocalyptic literature? Very common in this time period. Lots of symbols. What else? Maybe an intentionally hidden message, but my dad hasn't been in the class, so I wouldn't trust his answers. What else? It is a revelation, yes. That's what the word means. And it's also, in this instance, revelation is also a prophecy, okay? Here's some things to remind you of what we talked about then. And again, we should have been better, I should have been better of calling this back to our minds more frequently. It's been probably 2 whole months at this point since we've said anything about it, okay? Jordan mentioned this time period. Apocalyptic literature is very common from after the time of Daniel, after the exile and living in the land of the intertestamental period we talk about, largely because of how difficult that time was for God's people. A lot of persecution, some of the worst persecution the Jews ever faced was in this time period, in between the Testaments. And apocalyptic literature kind of grows out of a time of crisis, particularly God's people under attack. Okay? What it does is exactly what's been said. It reveals. Apocalyptic literature pulls back the curtain and shows you something bigger and higher and more real than what you're seeing with your eyeballs. Okay? Apocalyptic literature zooms way out to show you immense timelines of human history, right? To see things from a heavenly perspective. And also spatially, apocalyptic literature takes you into the heavens, right? To see the dwelling place of God or the realm of angels, right? So on and so forth, okay? So it reveals a transcendent reality. It is, as Lee said, highly symbolic, okay? It's also, apocalyptic literature tells a story. It's a drama. It's not just like hieroglyphics with kind of, random symbols here and there. The symbols are part of a drama or a story that's unfolding. And the gist of the story in apocalyptic literature is basically always this. Evil and good are in a conflict, in a war with one another, and God wins. And you can understand why that would be the message of this kind of writing that's written in a time of crisis, because God's victory appears to be in doubt when you're a Jew living under the terrorful reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, for instance, who's defiling the temple and killing your brethren. Where is God in all of this? Well, apocalyptic literature pulls back the curtain, it shows you the bigger picture, and it says God wins in the end. And it's intended to be shocking, or at least to get your attention, but ultimately so that the person reading it can understand it, be comforted, and be challenged, depending on which category you're in. If you're faithful, it comforts you. If you're giving into unfaithfulness or compromise, then it challenges you. Okay? So that's the kind of writing Revelation is, and hopefully, even though we haven't talked about this in particular, you've seen this sort of thing playing out over and over in the book of Revelation. And it looks something like this. I showed you this on Sunday, that you have at the beginning of the book, the setting, as in any story. You open up with the setting, the where and the when and all that kind of who. And what we learn in the first 3 chapters is that Jesus is revealing himself to God's people in a time of crisis. Okay, John is in exile for his testimony of the word. The 7 churches are all in their own different versions of a crisis, whether they're being persecuted or whether they're compromising with sin or whether they're become apathetic over time. Okay, they're in crisis, and Jesus is addressing them. But when we zoom out, I guess this is how you say that, we see that really the setting is God on his throne. Okay, God is reigning, and his plan, that scroll in the hand of the one who sits on the throne, God's plan will be carried out through the Lamb, of course, through Jesus. And we get different angles or different pictures of God's plan working out over the next chapters of Revelation. In particular, we've identified at least four cycles in the body of Revelation that really tell the same story or tell a very similar story in different ways about God's judgment on the earth, about God protecting his people, about God's people being used to testify in the midst of a world that's being judged for their unfaithfulness, okay? And particularly here in the middle, which we'll talk about in a second, this storyline of the dragon, Satan, and how he's attacking God's people, and how he's using the beast, the empire, to war against God's people, to deceive them, to draw them away into idolatry. And all of these pictures, each of these cycles, helps to explain what's going on. It helps to explain the tribulation that God's people are experiencing. And of course, it zooms out and shows you the big picture. I would argue that all of these cycles, by the end, show you what's going to happen in the end. Whether that's the final and ultimate defeat of evil, or whether it's showing you the final and ultimate victory of God and his people in the end. But they all tell you that story to show you, here's what's going on now, and here's where all this is headed. And it culminates at the end of the book to what I'm calling three final showdowns. Okay, the showdown where Babylon is once and for all taken down, the great city that started all the way back in Genesis chapter 11, right? The city of man, the city of rebellion, is taken down, and it is the bride, the city of God, that readies herself to be married to the Lamb. And then where we are right now is this kind of final showdown in which the beast and the false prophet, and then, as we'll see tonight, Satan himself are conquered as Jesus, riding on his white horse, reigns victorious over them. And then on Sunday and Wednesday, we will finish the class and finish the book talking about the New Jerusalem, finally cleansed of all impurities in the new heavens and the new earth. Okay? So one more review then to ask you. Because we're going to be talking more about the dragon tonight, what do you remember? And you can look in your Bible, that'd be fine too. Back in chapter 12, and I've also put on here that if chapter 9, the first part of it, is talking about the workings of Satan, of the evil one, what do we remember about the dragon from things that have already been said in the book of Revelation? What do you remember? Again, same as last time, just throw out some things that you remember. Causes trouble, Patty says. He's defeated. That's a big part of the story, right? What happens after he's defeated in chapter 12? Do you remember? He's thrown down, and you think, okay, that's nice, right? Our hands are clean. You know, Satan's been thrown down. But then what? Someone say, yeah, we'll get there. Someone say something else? Yeah, in chapter 12, remember the drama is that Satan is initially, from the beginning, he's opposed to God's plan, trying to get the Christ child, right, when he's born. But he's foiled in that attempt, and he is thrown down. You know, Michael and his angels in chapter 12 throw down the dragon to the earth, and you think, oh, that's the victory. And it actually says in there that he is conquered by the saints, okay? So you think, okay, good, we're rid of this dragon figure. But then the rest of the chapter, he is enraged against God's people. He's going after them, and that's what leads into chapter 13, when it's the dragon that raises up the beast, the empire, to go against God's people. So you have this drama of Satan's attacks, defeated, thrown down, but then after that, or because of that, is enraged against God's people. And I'll say one more thing, and this goes really more so back to chapter 9, where it talked about an angel that fell, or I should say, a star that fell from heaven in chapter 9 into the bottomless pit. It seems to be perhaps a reference to Satan. And that's when the demon locusts come out. I mean, can't forget the demon locusts, can we? Right? And at the end of talking about the demon locusts terrorizing the earth, it says they have a king over them whose name is Abaddon or Apollyon. We said that seems to be the Satan figure as well. Okay? And all of that shows us that in this picture of Revelation, yes, the Satan is acting of his own accord in his own rebellion. He's warring against God. He's warring against God's people. But I think in chapter 9 and even in other parts of the book, we see that God is ultimately the one in charge. And he's using Satan in all his rebellious schemes to actually carry out his purposes on the earth for judgment, maybe among other things as well. Okay, so that's the picture that we've seen so far. And I think we'll continue to see this theme about the dragon playing out in chapter 20. Yes, Brian, and then we'll move on. And if you remember that the raising up of the beast is in the Revelation how that's done. It raises up empire, a nation, and the nation draws people to worship the beast and to worship the dragon. As you're saying here, this kind of unawares worshiping of something else that in the end, if only they had eyes to see it, is the worship of the dragon himself. Okay, let's read chapter 20. And as we tried to do before, hear it, see it in your mind, and try to hold on to the big picture, and particularly in this case, the plot points, we might say, of the narrative that's unfolding, the drama that's unfolding in Revelation 20. Let's read it all together, then we'll go through and talk about it. Revelation 20 and verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years are ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence the earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what is written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Okay. Let's go through this in 3 sections. Let's talk first about the dragon's fall. And before I guess we go any further, this is the kind of disclaimer that probably is necessary in every class on the book of Revelation. But this chapter in particular, you may already be aware, is difficult for a few different reasons. One of them is because there seem to be some things mentioned in this chapter that aren't really mentioned other places, especially as it has to do with the end, the end of all things. And that's already a topic that we don't have a ton of information on in terms of specifics and details in the Bible. And then you get some new things here, and it can be very puzzling, right? And it's, as we've seen in Revelation, the symbolism is often hard to know what exactly to do with it. And so there are just some difficulties here. And I think no matter what you say about it by way of explanation, I should say whatever I say about it, I think you're going to notice, well, there's some holes or there's some questions that are not quite being answered. There's still some things I'm not sure about. And I think that's just the way that it's going to be in large part. And I might say this too, that I think because of the difficulty and the complexity of it, there is room for disagreement and seeing things differently in terms of what's going to happen. And actually, this particular chapter and some of the things that we're going to discuss, literally since the first centuries of Christians, for the last 2,000 years, people have been seeing these things very differently. And so there's room, I think, for God's people to understand these things differently and to treat each other with, of course, with kindness and charity about that, and to do our best to try to come to an understanding, first, of the main points and what the big picture is and what we can be certain of, and then from there, even work through some of the harder details. And so we'll get a taste of that over the next half hour, and then we'll continue to discuss it as much as you want after this. Okay? So let's look at this first part of the chapter, chapter 20, where it talks about the dragon's fall. And I would say that we're seeing something that we have seen before, not only in Revelation, but alluded to or talked about in other parts of the New Testament. Okay? I think I've referenced this before, that in Luke 10, when the disciples are sent out to cast out demons and to heal the sick during Jesus' ministry, Jesus says after that, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Okay? Now, when exactly is Jesus referring to that fall? Was it happening when Jesus saw it? Was he seeing a vision of the future? I don't think that's all that important. Okay? I think the point is, Jesus is saying and seeing that as a result of his ministry, Satan is going to be defeated. Okay? Satan is in the process of being defeated. Not on here, but you may remember another place that Jesus said, I have to bind the strong man, that is Satan. I have to bind him in order to plunder his goods, that is the souls that Satan has in his capture. Okay? So Jesus in his ministry used that language of binding Satan and him being cast down. Okay? In John 12:31, he tells the disciples, now the ruler of this world will be cast out. Okay? Again, talking about the result of his ministry being the casting out of Satan. And as we saw in Revelation 12, that earlier cycle of the signs pictured Satan being cast out of heaven, and there was victory over him. Okay? But in each of these other instances, and we saw this in Revelation 12, did the defeat of Satan, did the limiting of Satan, did the binding of Satan mean that he couldn't do anything else anymore? That he couldn't do any harm whatsoever? No, it didn't say that. We have to understand in all of these passages that Satan is defeated. He suffers a loss. He is bound, but that doesn't mean he can't keep working evil. And so when it says here that he was bound in verse 2 so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended, I don't think that means he can't do any deception whatsoever. I think there's this kind of general statement that the light of the gospel has gone to the nations, right? And it is the nations, actually, in the New Testament, the Gentiles more than the Jews, that are coming into the kingdom. And so Satan's powers of deception have been severely limited. He has been cast down. He has been defeated, though that doesn't mean he can't do anything at all, because, of course, he continues to work and continues to deceive and harass. But this is pictured as going on for 1,000 years. And hopefully by this point in Revelation, you're not expecting me to take 1,000 years as a literal number. I mean, there hasn't been a single number in Revelation, I guess excepting the 7 churches. I think there's literally 7 churches because they're named, right? But there hasn't been a single number in Revelation that we've taken literally, okay? And I'm not going to take this one literally either. I heard someone reference this Psalm 50. I thought it was really good. All of the beasts of the field are mine, a cattle on 1,000 hills. The psalm says, belong to the Lord, okay? Just 1,000 hills? No, it means all the hills and all the cattle, right? There's this sense of completeness. It's a long time, okay? So we have this picture of Satan being defeated and that, going on for this long, maybe even endless amount of time, okay? And during this time, as you get into verse 4 to 6, during this time as Satan has been defeated, you have some people reigning. And we shouldn't notice, by the way, that it says that it is though these others. It doesn't say that Christ is reigning for the 1,000 years. He is, of course. but it is that they are reigning with him. They are going to participate in his reign for 1,000 years. Okay? And who is it that's participating with Jesus in this great reign and this conquering over Satan? Well, it's the same thing that we've seen at other points in the book of Revelation before. It's those in verse 4 who have been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, those who had not worshiped the beast. It is the faithful witnesses that conquer Satan and that share, that participate in Jesus' victory and in his reign, even though they have been slain on the earth. Okay, so in chapter 12, it said this. It said that that the dragon had been cast down, and it says that salvation and power and kingdom of our God and authority of Christ has come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses him day and night. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. And then in the picture of chapter 11, the two witnesses, they are standing up for the testimony of Jesus. They are slain by the beast, but then they are raised to life, and they are exalted into heaven. And so I think the picture here is of those who have died for the cause of Christ, and they get to participate in the reign of Christ, just as he became king by giving his own life and then being resurrected. Okay? And it says this is what is being described here. It says in verse 5 and 6 is the first resurrection. Okay? And I'll give you two options here. As the way I've kind of been explaining over the last couple minutes, maybe you're picking up on this, is that it is those who have been slain, those who have died, right, been faithful unto death, those who have been, martyred or whatever. It is the dead saints that are participating in the reign of Christ. Okay, if you go with that kind of exclusive group, then think about passages like, Revelation 11. The witnesses are raised in chapter 11, but it's not describing their bodily resurrection that will happen in the end, but it's a picture of them winning the victory after they have given their life. Or maybe in John 11:35, when Jesus says, those who believe in me, though they die, will live. Okay? Now maybe Jesus is talking about the final resurrection, but one option here is that the first resurrection is when the faithful saint dies, they get to be with Jesus, as Paul says. And they get to, even in that state, get to participate with Jesus' reign. Okay? Or if you want to take a view that says, well, all the saints are those that are reigning with Christ during this time period, then you maybe look at a passage like John 5:26 that says there's coming a day when those who are dead will hear the word of God and live. Or Romans 6 that talks about our baptism as a resurrection. And say the first resurrection is when you're in union with Christ and made alive from your sins, and you begin to reign, to participate in the reign of God with Christ, like Ephesians 2, exalted to sit in the heavenly places with him, or something like that. Okay? Comments or questions through verse 6, since that's all clear as day.
Yeah, a question. Is this perhaps the answer to the question that the saints under the altar in Revelation 6, verse 9, how long? Well, here's the answer to that. This is the scene of their question.
Thank you, Robert. No, I think you're right to connect those passages, right? That early in the book we have them, they've been slain for the cause of Christ, and they're saying, when are you going to vindicate us? And here we see that they're actually participating, getting to share in that reign with Christ, even now, even though they're still waiting for, the victory, full victory. Yeah, Ian, and then Brian.
I've heard arguments that the 1,000 years has already passed. Any insight as to whether or not that might be true or not? The 1,000 years, if it's not representative of a real number, could that 1,000 years have happened when Christ, in the time between Christ died and was resurrected, and now Satan is, that put an end to it?
I mean, like we've said, I don't think we're intended to construct a real definite timeline from these things, whether it's literal or not. But I think what we'll see in the next few verses is that the end of this is essentially the end, or at least the time right before the end. So maybe we are in that time. That's not for us to know, I guess. But I would think that what's being described here is the time that we're living in, if we're supposed to correlate it that closely. that we're living in the time that those who die get to participate in the reign of Christ, as you know, and Satan's defeat. Brian?
Well, to my knowledge, and it's probably limited, but I'm aware it speaks of two deaths, and it talks about the first resurrection, implying or suggesting or stating there's a second. So I'm aware that there's two resurrections and there's two deaths, the physical death and then eternal death. And then the first resurrection is when we're baptized into Christ and raised in newness of life. And the second resurrection is on the last day when the saints are resurrected with Christ. And so that's what I'm saying here by the resurrection. And I put that in the context of a question because I think you were saying that Satan was bound during a time when conversions were taking place and people were becoming the children of God. And it sounds like to me that Satan is bound during the so-called Christian dispensation from the point that Christ died and the church started adding the saints. And of course, the saints ultimately reign with Christ through eternity. And it sounds like to me the church here is what's being referred here to in defeating Satan.
Like I said, there's going to be different ways to see it, and I think what you're describing is a very common, and there's a lot to support that view that it is, as we said earlier, and I think this is basically right, that it is Jesus' work is what defeats Satan. It's what casts him down and binds him, right? And at that point, there is those that die for the cause of Christ can participate in their reign with him. Now, the difference is, or the question is, do you want to say, well, what it's describing here is the first resurrection is all believers that when they're baptized, they are the ones here that are raised up and reigning with Christ? Or is this passage, talking about those who have been killed and they get to then participate, as martyred saints in the kind of reign with Christ? Sure, yeah. Yeah, or maybe it may just be a question of what this particular passage is referring to. Because you can go to other passages to say that all of us as Christians reign with Christ, but that doesn't necessarily mean that here in Revelation it's talking about all Christians. It may be wanting to highlight in particular those who have died for the cause of Christ and their participation in the reign. Okay, one more, Jordan, then we're gonna go here. Oh, go to Albert, and then if Jordan decides his is important, you can come back to him.
Two things. One, I appreciate the beginning of class when you talked about we're going to work through this and we're going to have different things that we're taking away and seeing from it. And I think to summarize what I'm hearing is we just have to be extremely careful not to bind anything and force it. And I appreciate you saying that because it allows me to relax and work through my thoughts. And the second thing is just I take great encouragement when I see, and I know in other texts when it talks about angel came down and wrestled with, it just, the first two verses, how Satan is just overcome and bound is encouraging to me, as well as telling me, who do I want to be with? Do I want to be with, battling Satan, worrying and seeing him as somebody that can't be defeated, or do I want to be with God who can, and this is my words, come down and bind him? And you don't read of a struggle. You don't read of how many angels were called and how it had to be. It's just, angel came down and bound him, and that's just encouraging to me to be faithful, to be a Christian.
Oh, amen. Thank you, Albert. Okay, we're in the same chapter here, and so we're around the same kinds of things. But so in the first 6 verses, you have Satan bound, and as he's defeated, the faithful witnesses, whoever those are, right? But the faithful witnesses reign with Christ and share in that victory over Satan, okay? But in verse 7, it says that that time period comes to an end, and Satan is released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they march up to have this battle, and they are defeated, okay? This, to me, I don't put these verses up here to say, Revelation 20, verse 7 is the same as, what's being described in 2 Thessalonians 2 or in Romans 1. But I put 2 Thessalonians 2 and Romans 1 up on the board because they are passages in which it says that part of God's judgment on evil is to willingly hand people over to being deceived, right? 2 Thessalonians 2 says that God is going to send them a spirit of delusion, okay? Romans 1 and 24, 26, and 28 says God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts or to their unnatural ways of living, okay? And if you go back to the beginning of that section, Romans 1:18, Dad was cluing me in on this as we were talking about it. The beginning of that section is the announcement that the wrath of God has been revealed. How does God reveal his wrath? Well, in part, by handing people over to be deceived, okay? So whatever Revelation 20 verse 7 is referring to, if it's referring to some kind of historical time period yet to come or now, in which, Satan is free to do more than he was before, it shouldn't necessarily surprise us that that's part of God's plan. Okay, we've seen God use Satan before, and in particular, what I'm saying is we see that one of the ways that God brings his judgment on people upon the earth is by letting them be deceived or handing them over to deception. But let me say this about this section here. This is, I think, more important here. It talks about Gog and Magog, the nations that come out in battle, and they march up on the broad plain, and they surround the camp of the saints, verse 9, in the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. I should have asked you before I clicked it, okay? Somebody here, surely, Jordan's like, oh yeah, it's Ezekiel 38. I knew that. Ezekiel 38 and 39, which hasn't been that long ago. It's been like a year, so we don't remember anything. I don't remember much about it. I had to go back and remind myself. Gog and Magog, those names come from Ezekiel 38 and 39. And here, I'm just going to summarize real quick what is going on in Ezekiel 38 and 39, because I think John here, or the Holy Spirit in Revelation, is doing something very, very similar. Here's what's going on in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 34 to 37, we have all these promises of restoration and renewal. I mean, these are the passages about God's going to bring his people back to the land, and he's going to plant them in the land again in security. These are the passages about God giving his people a new heart and a new spirit. 37 is the passage about God breathing life into the valley of dry bones, and they are a resurrected army, okay? I mean, these are just glorious, wonderful passages about God fulfilling his promises and restoring his people. And then in chapter 38, you have this picture of the greatest army ever amassed in the world, gathering together and coming in battle against Jerusalem and against God's people. Okay, and it's so exaggerated; it's clearly made up, right? And even the names, I say made up in the sense that it's this kind of fantasy scenario. Okay, Gog and Magog are not real references on the map or to people in history. They're names that have been derived from maybe from the book of Genesis, but are not real in the historical sense. And so what you have in 38 and 39 of Ezekiel is this picture where God, after he's brought his people back to the land and fulfilled his promises, says, okay, I'm bringing the worst possible army, the biggest possible army against you. And even in that case, right, even in that case, I will protect you and I will deliver you. Because what happens in Ezekiel 39 is there's essentially no battle. The army is slain. And then all of Ezekiel 39 is about the cleanup, okay? If you remember some of this stuff. It takes them 7 months going throughout the land to bury all the dead bodies of the armies of Gog. And for 7 years, they don't need firewood because they just keep burning the weapons of the armies of Gog, right? The picture is of a huge army, right? The worst the world can throw at God's people, and yet even then, God is going to protect and to deliver them. And I think there's something like that happening here in Revelation 20, that right before we get to the end, and again, this doesn't have to be a chronological historical sequence, but in the thinking and in the development of the drama, right before the end, right, it gets really bad. Right, what did it say? The It's darkest right before the dawn kind of thing, okay? Where right at the end, Satan does one last horrible attempt to deceive and to oppose and to rebel and to bring the nations against God's people. He's going to throw his worst at them. And yet, as we see in the text, verse 9, again, it's no contest. Fire comes down from heaven, okay, and consumes all of them. And verse 10, the devil and those who have deceived are thrown into the lake of fire. And that kind of picks up where chapter 19 ended, with the beast and the false prophet being thrown into the lake of fire. Now, they're joined by Satan, okay? And he's cast into eternal destruction, right? Comments or questions through this section here, through verse 10? Okay. That's a good question, John. Does Satan know this? Okay. So I think I mentioned this before, but the kind of quintessential example of God using Satan for his purposes is the cross, right? Because Satan, in that moment, he wouldn't go through with that if he knew what the final outcome would be. Okay. And so he thinks he's winning, and he's playing right into God's hands of doing the very thing that's going to end up defeating him, right? Now, at that point, does he know? I mean, Revelation 12 seems to paint the picture that once he's cast out of heaven, he knows the game's up, and he's just trying to do as much damage as he can before God calls time, right? And so maybe that's still the picture here, right? That when God, in the sense that God gives him allowances at some point to do more harm, maybe he thinks he's going to somehow still turn the tables and win, or maybe he's just, knows he has a short time and is going to do his worst in his pride and his rebellion, right? But Robert, I think Ian had something.
Yeah, you already made the connection for us, so this is not a leap. But it looks like Ezekiel 34 all the way through 40, where it talks about God winning, then the last push, and then the new city. That's a complete parallel with what we're about to see in 2021. 18, 19, 20, 2021. So obviously, I think you think that God put this in here for them, the churches of the first century, to look back and say, hey, we already heard this story. It was in Ezekiel, Gog and Magog. There's our clue. It's not hard.
Yeah. And it's a pattern that's repeated over and over again, right? And I was thinking about this, talking with a friend about it today. In some ways, that's the pattern of the Exodus story, right? The 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, the Passover, that's like the death blow, right? That's it. Except for it's not. Because then Pharaoh, with one last gasping attempt, says, I'm going for it, right? And he chases them out into the wilderness. It's like, there's got to be this one final chase down, harassing of God's people before God brings the water over them and crushes them, okay? Now, this is kind of gets back to where we're saying Revelation. Does that have to then mean that, historically speaking, that before the second coming, there's got to be this period that's worse than all other historical periods? Maybe. I don't know. That's in God's hands, okay? But I think we're seeing more about the greater story of how God works in the world, right? And how he judges the earth, how Satan works in the world. You have this final rebellion before it's all over for him. And then that brings us to the great white throne scene in verse 11 to 15, okay? And I would say this about the throne and the one seated on it. I think it brings us back, another kind of tie back. We saw this in chapter 19 with the four living creatures and the 24 elders, bringing us back to where we started, okay? And here we are again back to where we started. God sitting on the throne, okay? We've seen a lot transpire in the meantime. We've learned a lot about God's plan for history, but in the end, we kind of come back to where we started. God reigns, and God sits on the throne, and he sits there with his heavenly council in chapter 5 is the picture, and here he sits as a judge. He is holy and he's transcendent. He's praised for that in chapter 5 here. That's probably the sense from the earth and sky fleeing away from him, right? He's holy, he's transcendent, and he sits for judgment, right? The dead stand before him, and he opens the books. And I think these two things, to me, kind of go side by side. And one of those is that God does judge each according to their deeds, according to what they have done. We see that other places in the Bible, 2 Corinthians 5, for instance, okay? But you also have this another reference here, the fourth time in Revelation, to the book of life, right? And to me, those two things, in some way, I think, in my mind, put together this sense of the grace of God and his choosing of his people and faithfulness to them as a part of his eternal plan, right? God is the one who saves, right? We're saved by grace through faith, by trusting in God and in his Son. And yet, he's also holding accountable all the dead and all of us for the lives that we have lived and what we have done. And I think the book of life, along with the books that are open to judge them for their deeds, kind of put both of those ideas together. And where this chapter ends is with the defeat of the last enemy, okay? The beast and the false prophet were cast into the lake of fire in chapter 19. Chapter 20, we saw the dragon, Satan, cast into the lake of fire. And here we see the final enemy, death and the grave, thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Death itself has to die, right, in this final victory of God. And that, I think, fits with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that the last enemy to be conquered is death, okay? And bonus points, the person who can tell me in what novel series that line plays heavily in the last book. It's written on somebody's tombstone. It isn't Harry Potter. Yep, that's the epigraph on the tomb of his parents, right? Yeah. The last enemy to be conquered is death. Okay, a couple minutes here, so you can tell me this if you want to shout out some thoughts here. What do we make of all this? I know there's a lot here we don't understand, but hopefully we've tried to highlight the things that we do understand. And what does it do for you in terms of perspective going forth from here? God wins. Amen. Thank you, Christy. You want to elaborate, or are you just going to leave it there?
Satan. Different, which is, I mean, obviously God's created a world, but clearly Satan, if you want to call it the first defeat, still has authority and control and is allowed to deceive the children of God. And God does not directly intervene to stop that deception, which we saw that way back in the garden, that pattern. So if anything, maybe to Albert's point a second ago, this should be maybe a sobering type chapter to consider. Make sure we're not being deceived.
Thank you, Jordan. Brian?
Excuse me. What I'm seeing here is what we started out, and that is Satan warred in heaven, he was cast out, and the war and the spiritual battle continued on the face of this earth, and this seems to be the final battle, if you will. We've been assured that we would have victory through Christ, and of course 1 Corinthians 15 tells us the victory is ours, but we must stand firm in our faith. And so you see the final conclusion here, and with Satan being cast out into the lake of fire, and then he had, sin is the power of death, and sin has been destroyed. Therefore, death no longer exists, and we have victory in Christ. Something along those lines. I'm still confused about the 1,000 years, but it sounds like to me that's perhaps the Christian dispensation where this war takes place between the sons of God who are in the church of Christ, standing against Satan.
Well, you're not alone in being confused about it, so don't expect me to have all the answers. But the bell is rung. I think that's a good place to leave it. So we'll work our way into the final two chapters, chapter 21 on Sunday. Thank you, guys.